Mind is a natural progression of 12 previous books, and they've all played around the edges of the one mind concept. But the one mind is an idea that really is quite ancient. I know it sounds fairly modern, but really it goes back a long way. And the thing that's new about it is its endorsement by people that you wouldn't think would go in that direction, such as Nobel Prize winning physicists and experimentalists in medicine and so on. So there's a lot of evidence that we have that is contemporary, which the ancients did not have, even though the basic idea is the same.
One thing that jumped out at me is you're playing around with the golden rule, and that's serious stuff to me because my father raised us very strictly on the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But you say that perhaps it should be rewritten: be kind to others because in some sense they are you. Is that an important change to the golden rule? Because the golden rule seems so darn good.
Well, I think it's a great starting point, and it's a great ethical and moral commandment in my judgment. But I think it can be expanded based on recent findings that we are connected. I think that the golden rule assumes that there's differences. There are separations and boundaries that keep us apart as human beings. And I think that's the source of a great deal of mischief in the world, this idea that we're tribal, that it's me against you. I think that sets the stage for greed and possessiveness, which we could circumvent if we had the courage to follow experiments and people's experiences, which show that we are connected. I don't think that this is an arguable point anymore, although skeptics think that this is hopelessly spiritual, because there is just an incredible body of evidence that suggests that our thoughts are connected with the thoughts of other people. In a sense, we couldn't even separate ourselves if we wanted to, and we tried. And God knows we have tried. I think that this idea of boundaries and separation sets the stage for some of the stuff that we talked on earlier about political differences, divisions that are hopelessly ingrained in human behavior and ethics and morals and religions. I think we could leapfrog a lot of those things and come out ahead if we were able to do so.
Yeah, staying on the political side a little bit, if you look at the founders of our country, I don't know how much you've studied that. I was a poli-sci major in college, but they were recognizing the nature of man, which is to be somewhat selfish, and for people in power to want power and thirst for more power. And so they put all these guards and protections up in our government, the checks and balances, et cetera, and smaller government and so on, because they recognize the limitations of man. And it seems to me on the other side, you have people who have a little bit more of a utopian view that believe that, no, we don't need to guard against that. Man is good. We're all one in this and that, and we don't need to protect against that. So talk to me a little bit about your thoughts about our political structure in light of your thinking of we're all one mind.
Well, I'm sensitive to the argument that people are scared of this idea of one mind because it sounds as if you buy into that, you're going to lose your sense of individuality. You'll just be homogenized in some formless mass of consciousness, and you can't tell yourself from anybody else. I think that what we're looking at here is what Niels Bohr called a case of complementarity. We are individuals. We have an ego. We have a sense of personhood. I'm not against any of that. But I think a coin has two sides. And I think the flip side of individuality is unity and the things that are associated with it, such as empathy and compassion and understanding. I think it's possible to err too much on one side or the other. I think we need both notions of who we are as human beings. Otherwise, we get into hopeless competition and antagonisms, which I think we've seen played out in the 20th century in spades. And I think that the way of avoiding that is to go beyond that and to look at the other side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is that there are no boundaries between consciousness. Consciousness We can insert information into the world and acquire it from the world. And in a sense, this no boundary idea, this one mind, is a safeguard against the excessive competition, war, greed, possessiveness that seems to be failing us in a major way on the planet these days.
Right. But to get all to embrace this is a pretty lofty goal, and we seem a long way from that. I mean, some would say the closest you get to it is some of the religions where they talk about, us all being together and God being within us and so on. But the religions are all fighting each other. So even
Right.
in the groups that seem to want to embrace something along these lines, they all want to fight among themselves.
Well, that's one reason I think we want to extend and push the notion of the golden rule, which has been embraced by a lot of religions. There's a form of it in every major religion, and it just hasn't captured people's imagination as it should. I think, in a sense, the major religions have failed us. One of the points that I try to bring forth in this book, The One Mind, is that this is beyond religion. The endorsers of the idea of a unitary collective consciousness are, for goodness sakes, Nobel Prize winning physicists and scientists of various disciplines. And in a sense, I think they've out spiritualized the religions. If you look at the comments of Nobel Prize winner Erwin Schrödinger, who won the Nobel Prize in 1933 in physics, and the opinions of Max Planck, who, for goodness sakes, established quantum physics. If you look at Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, the ideas of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who believed in the oversoul, you begin to get a picture that there's something beyond this idea of doing unto the others as you would have them do unto you, that honors that, but goes beyond it. And I think it's this going beyond the idea of individuality that we're challenged with now. I think that this is a pernicious idea to dwell ceaselessly and endlessly on this idea of individuality. I think that we have taken this idea in American culture that you have to lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's almost American heresy to think that, somebody's going to do it for you. But I think it has to be both. And I think we are adrift if we just go in one direction or the other. So I'm opting for a complementary approach to honoring who we are, honoring individuality to a certain extent, but not hesitating to go the next step where we say that there are really ultimately no boundaries between human consciousness.
Okay, so let's make sure that people understand when you talk about one mind, just describe for us what you mean by that. And then also, since you are an MD and a scientist, what is the scientific evidence of it?
Well, the basic idea of the one mind is that beyond the individual expressions of consciousness, such as our individual thoughts and attitudes, emotions, and that sort of thing, there's a substrate underneath this that makes individual awareness possible. And that's what people in the consciousness research community roundly refer to as consciousness. Consciousness makes individual awareness possible. It is the foundation on which individual mind is based. And so that's the picture that I think is going to win the day, not only because people throughout history have experienced this sort of unity consciousness in terms of epiphanies, religious experiences, near-death experiences, and so on, and because of actual experiments. So there's a two-pronged reason to advance this notion of the one mind. One is experiences that people have always had, that there is such a unitary composite that envelops all of us. But we can supplement that now with something that people have not had before. And that's where experiments come in. As far as my experience as a doctor, I began to take note about 30 years ago of actual experiments where people could actually, with their thoughts and attitudes, emotions and prayers and positive thoughts affect biological activities in not just other people, but in non-humans, such as the replication rates of bacteria in test tubes, the growth rates of fungi on petri dishes in laboratories. And now these studies have been actually extended by Bill Bingston and others to heal actual cancers that have been transplanted into experimental animals, such as mice.
They're all available.
These are some of the most compelling
Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. We'll be back next week
pieces of evidence that I know of
Hidden Truth.
that shows that consciousness is not confined to your brain. It has the ability to insert information out there into the world and make a medically important difference.
Could you, describe for me what you consider to be the most impressive study to date that confirms this?
Yes, I can. Listeners might want to look at the book, The Energy Cure. It's written by Dr. Bill Bingston, who has replicated these experiments about 16 times now in academic centers in the United States. What he does is to transplant mammary cancer, breast cancer in women, into test animals. These are a certain strain of mice. And then he has taught people to use a consciousness-based technique of healing these mice. Now, this is where this begins to make people's brows wrinkle and their eyes roll. They don't understand how this could possibly be true. Neither does Bingston. This is why experimental evidence is so important. The outcome, if you don't do anything to these mice with the breast cancer that has been transplanted into them, within 30 days, they're all dead. It's a terrible thing to do to animals, to transplant this cancer into them. However, if these college sophomores and students that he has trained to do this technique apply it in these mice, around 90% of them get well. Now,
what are the students doing?
They're intending healing for these mice.
Thinking positive, healing thoughts?
Right. That's exactly right. There is a specific technique which Bingston has devised, which to the newcomer who thinks that none of this is possible, I would simply say, look at the results of the experiments. I think they're inarguable. And I'm happy in a sense that this can't be groks. I mean, there's no real way to understand how your thoughts make a biological difference in a rat that would otherwise die of cancer. All I can say is, here are the experiments. You know, you can take them or leave them. And I think skepticism is a wonderful tool to apply to trying to understand these outcomes. These are supplemented by dozens of other experiments in other forms of life, such as I've mentioned, growth rates of bacteria in test tubes, growth rates of fungi on laboratory discs, and so on.
Well, let's stick with the mice or rats for a second. What, assuming this is correct, that this is proving to have an impact, what would be the scientific explanation as to what's going on?
Well, I think in order to make sense of this, you have to assume that consciousness is not confined to people's minds. And this is where I think the great stumbling block is here. The materialistic notion that we've all been raised with, from high school to college to postgraduate levels, is that consciousness is produced by the brain. It's confined to the brain. It can't escape the cranium and make a difference in the world. These studies show that that is simply not true. It is a belief system that I think is simply untenable with respect to these studies.
Larry, could you do me a favor? Could you make sure your mic hasn't moved at all? Suddenly the volume is lower.
Okay, I can lean forward.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe that's what happened. Thank you. Right. Okay, sorry. Keep going. So in addressing, well, I think what would be the scientific explanation, if we know? Maybe we don't have a scientific explanation yet for it, but what would be the scientific explanation for how someone thinking positive thoughts about cancer in a mouse could cure that cancer?
Well, I think that the explanation that is going to carry the day eventually is that consciousness is not confined to the brain. It is what researchers are beginning to call a non-local phenomenon. non-local is just simply a fancy word for infinite. Consciousness apparently has no boundaries to it. You can't keep it locked up inside the brain, the cranium. It has a way of acting in the world. The mice experiments that Bingston has been doing are supplemented by a host of other studies in different life forms. I'm not talking about just one experimental model here. There have been books that have been written for lay people to introduce people to this idea of the non-local actions of consciousness. Dean Radin's books, The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, are two that have become quite popular and bestsellers. My book, Healing Words, which was written to introduce people to this idea in 1993, sort of broke the ice on these experiments. And since those days, these experiments have multiplied tremendously.
But I mean, science has been trying to cure cancer for, decades with, starting to have some success, but certainly it's been very slow and very expensive. But you're suggesting that cancer can be healed as easily as simply thinking about sending out positive thoughts.
Well, I want to be careful here. These are studies in animals. These studies have not been replicated in people. So this is a starting point. I mean, this breaks the ice. In many areas of medicine, we take a sequential approach to human studies. For example, bacteria are subjected to the possible effects of antibiotics. We do early studies on animals, and then we up the ante finally to studies in human beings. So I think that's where we are right now. We know there is an effect. It's consciousness mediated. Distance is not a factor. And these studies have powerful outcomes. So the next step, I think, is to try to replicate these studies in people. Now, there have been studies using positive, empathic, compassionate attitudes and intentions in people in coronary care units and that sort of thing. So we do have studies in people, but not in the mammary cancer model that I've been describing to you that Bingston has used. But that's the next step.
So if we are all of one mind, what does that tell us about who we are, what we are, what this is all about?
Well, I think that's where the game really gets interesting. My profession has prepared me to really put the emphasis on practicality. I mean, what can you do with this stuff? And we look toward healing and better methods of curing people, but I think that's only the starting point. Where I think we wind up with this is a new way of looking at our destiny. And this is the ultimate idea I tried to express in my book, One Mind. If there are no boundaries in space and time for consciousness, which I think the evidence compels us to entertain, then we begin to raise questions about, well, so what? What if the mind is infinite in time? What if there are no boundaries in time for consciousness? What if consciousness is infinite in time? This leads us directly to the consideration of immortality for some aspect of who we are. An immortal mind is an infinite mind in time. It isn't bounded in time, and it isn't restricted to the present moment. And so I think that necessarily spiritual considerations flow from this evidence pointing toward non-local consciousness. I don't believe that we can restrict considerations of non-local infinite mind just to medicine and health and healing. I think it escapes those attempts at restriction. And this is where I think it gets very fascinating. I happen to believe from my experience as a physician that the fear of death and annihilation has probably caused more suffering in the history of the human race than all the physical diseases combined.
Because
people have a fear of death and annihilation. They
therefore do what?
They, try to deny it in various ways. Ernest Becker wrote Pulitzer Prize winning book in the 70s called The Denial of Death, which summarized the ways that people sort of ignore the obvious, which is that so far everybody dies. The evidence is pretty compelling. Nobody gets out of here alive. And so this idea of non-locality in time says that there's another option. There's an aspect of consciousness that couldn't die if it tried. Now, I think we have a beginning way of coming to look at this in an objective form. For example, 15 million Americans now have had what they call near-death experiences, in which they have a profound sense of surviving death. There are now thousands of children who have been investigated by first-rate people like the late Dr. Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia, kids who, between the ages of 6 and 9, begin to talk about a previous life, and which, when it's investigated, seems to bear evidence for. And so I think there are little tags and twists that we can point to that suggest that we're not deceiving ourselves when we bring up this idea of non-local, immortal consciousness. I think it is a very real possibility that we've ignored for too long.
But let me ask you this: if consciousness doesn't die, then what is a near-death experience? Why would you have a near-death experience if consciousness doesn't die?
Well, I emphasize with the word near. None of these people who come back are actually dead. They are resuscitated in coronary care units and so on. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know why the world is so constructed that these people would have experiences like this. Maybe there's some cosmic menacing trickster that's deceiving people when they come back with experiences like this. But I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the avalanche of people who have these experiences. 15 million is not a small number, and it's about 5% of the American population. I think these people should be taken seriously.
And what are people of the various religions to think of this? Let's just start with Christians who believe that if you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell, and so forth. How does a Christian reconcile their beliefs with this one mind theory?
Well, I think with great difficulty. For example, most Christians believe in a hellish, eternal damnation type of scenario for people who weren't very good on this side. You don't see that in people who have had near-death experiences. These horrible scenarios just are extremely rare. I had an opportunity to talk to the leader of this investigative effort, Dr. Ian Stevenson, about whether or not people come back with these with horrible experiences, and he said, "We don't see that." So I'm saying that there may be some considerable revisions that are in store for some of the leading religions of the day here, and I think that would not be a bad thing.
But that's what Christians say, the reason that you have to be good to other people, otherwise you're going to go to hell. So if there's no hell, then are people not going to be good to each other anymore?
Yeah, well, I would debate that. I think one of the reasons people can find to be kind and compassionate and empathic with other people is that they're connected with them. And I think that's a more powerful potential motivator for goodness, for good behavior on this side than threats of damnation and hell.
Yeah, well, if we're all one, then that certainly is a reason. I also would posit that the golden rule provides that to be good to others, treat others as you would want them do to you. I guess then it begs the question, well, why treat others as you would want to be treated? And I think that there's an evolutionary explanation for that through evolving, people realize that, hey, wait a minute, if I only act in my naked self-interest, that doesn't work very well. Society works better if we all get along and we work together, and that we've realized that through evolution, that, if people were only acting in their naked self-interest, that we would destroy ourselves. So the golden rule has come about, and people do treat the concepts of love and caring for others has developed through natural evolution.
Yes, well, I think the argument is good as far as it goes, but I think it sort of fizzled out in terms of its evolutionary value. For example, I truly believe that if people had some sense of unity and connectedness with other life forms on the planet, we would not be in the position we're in these days of the problems that we just can't run away from, such as species decline, such as climate catastrophe, such as the declining population of mammals across the planet. I would argue that the Golden Rule has not done us a favor.
But how do you explain all of these people in groups that do want to protect these animals and all the measures that are in place? There's been a lot of species that almost went extinct, and then we've saved them, and man got together and saved them. I mean, why did man do that?
Well, I think that that's good as far as it goes, but I think that the scenario for the survival of life on this planet is not as rosy as you might believe. I think that if we had carried the Golden Rule to its conceivable limits, that we would be in better shape than we are right now. Just from a medical standpoint, we are looking at predictable disasters for the way we have mismanaged the climate with increasing tropical diseases that are creeping up the United States borders. I would argue that that we could have done a lot better if we had had a greater sense of responsibility, not just to other people, but for all of sentient life. And I think that we're paying a price for that now because we haven't carried the Golden Rule as far as it could go. And I would argue that a sense of oneness and identity with other living things is potentially a much more effective way of preserving life on this planet, including saving our own butts.
You have an identical twin.
I do.
Tell me about that and what you've learned from that.
Well, I became interested in twin stuff, which is what my brother and I used to call these experiences we had as identical twins growing up. A few years ago, when people began to talk about something called telesomatic experiences between identicals. Not all twins experience this, but about 20 or 30% identical twins have experiences that are identical, even though they're far apart. They can have physical symptoms that occur simultaneously, although they're not in sensory contact. My brother and I used to have these things all of the time. Growing up, we didn't know that there was anything heretical or blasphemous about this. We didn't know we weren't supposed to have those things, and we just called it twin stuff. Now there are books detailing these strange occurrences in detail. For example, one example that I write about are twin girls, 4-year-old twin girls in Spain, who several kilometers apart had an identical phenomenon. When one touched a red-hot iron and erupted in a second-degree burn, the other, several kilometers away, erupted in the second-degree burn on the same hand, on the same pattern. This is one of these strange events which are not uncommon in twins, and which, by the way, offer indirect evidence that we're all connected in some strange way via consciousness. And you see this dramatically in twins, not just in twins. The common denominator is people who are closely, intimately related emotionally. Lovers, parents and children, and so on, frequently have these experiences. And they're just mind-boggling. There's no way physically that you could posit transmission of any kind of signal between one and the other. So this is one of the jaw-dropping experiences that I personally have been involved with, suggesting that we're related via consciousness.
What have you had with your own brother?
Bruises, injuries that occur at the same time in the same place. I don't mention thoughts. We have a way of reading each other's minds, but this could just be psychology, creeping out into public display. But for me, the physical symptoms that have been recorded many, many times in books, such as Twin Telepathy by Guy Playfair, if people want to look at some literary source that goes into these things, I'll tell you, it's mind-boggling. It puts this idea of a connective link that defies spatial separation right in your face. I don't know how to explain this. I think there is no explanation except to posit that there is some non-local connection between us that just shakes its fist in temporal and spatial dislocation.
So, does one mind extend to life beyond Earth?
Well, we haven't tested that yet, have we?
Well, there seems to be a lot of things buzzing around in the air these days.
Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon, did an experiment on his return from the moon. He had a Confederate in some city in the United States where he did a telepathy experiment, and the guy in the Earth, several thousand miles away, Mitchell being in outer space, the individual that he was conveying the message to got the message in detail. As far as I know, this is the only experiment that's ever been attempted from outer space, and it was positive.
It was positive. What was the experiment? Do you remember?
It was the conveying of some complex message. I'm not sure what it was. I think he goes into this in some detail in his book about his experiences called The Way of the Explorer.
Why would he choose to do that from the moon? It seems like a hard enough thing to do in the same room, let alone doing it from the moon. Was he thinking that perhaps in some way it may be easier being out in space?
I think he wanted to see if space and spatial separation could inhibit this signal or not. He was a very contemplative man about paranormal events. You may know that when he got back to Earth, he was so convinced about the unitary aspects of consciousness that he established the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is alive and well, still pursuing these sorts of events. And so he was just a curious fellow about how consciousness worked.
So we did a great interview with Anusha Ansari, who was the first female tourist in space, first Muslim woman in space. And she did speak about something that I know you write about, which is that people returning from space seem to have a different view about life on Earth and seem to view us all as one. When you view the Earth from a distance like that, the borders disappear and you look at Earth as your home, not your city as your home.
Well, that's certainly true. This has been called the overview effect by several astronauts, and actually it isn't limited to American astronauts. Russian cosmonauts have described precisely the same sensation from outer space, looking toward the Earth where you can't see any boundaries between nations. I think the only man-made object that is even remotely visible from the moon is the Great Wall of China in places. But otherwise, this little blue dot doesn't seem to have many separations.
Yeah, well, it's getting cheaper and cheaper to go into space. I think she paid $200,000, but it's getting down to, I think, for $20,000 now. I think that you can go into low orbit through, I think it's Virgin Galactic. So maybe as more people do that, maybe your belief will grow.
Well, it might. You sound like you're interested in going out into space yourself.
I would. I need the price to come down a little bit further, but when I can buy it on Expedia and earn points, I definitely down for that. What about one mind when it comes to animals? Are animals? You believe that all humans are of one mind? Is that unique to humans, and humans have one mind and dogs have another, or is it all lumped together?
Well, I think animals certainly have something that looks like one mind. If you look at the behavior of flocks of birds and schools of fish and herds of animals, what you see is simultaneous behavior involving sometimes thousands of specimens that is very, very difficult to explain in any other way than some sort of collective consciousness involving the whole group. The person who has studied this most carefully, I suppose, is Sir Rupert Sheldrake, a biologist in England, who has videoed dogs whose owners are returning from a great distance. When they begin to return home, the dogs seem to perk up. They seem more attentive, and this has been written up in great detail by Sheldrake, and I think it's a good starting point of looking at commonalities of consciousness in animals and humans. You see also expressions of behavior in animals that would be difficult to explain in any other way, I think. What I've written about is how animals sometimes rescue humans, they rescue other animals. What you see is this rescuing behavior in every possible combination. And I think probably this is an indirect evidence that we share consciousness with animals.
Well, it seems that birds and fish, I mean, there's, I don't know, what is it, sonic waves that's perhaps whales are picking up in water, and birds are picking up certain frequencies. I mean, dogs hear things that we don't hear. So it seems that there's frequencies out there, energies, I don't know how you would describe it, that animals pick up that humans don't.
Yeah, I think that's right in certain situations. However, people have looked at the ability of sonic waves and electromagnetic transmissions to explain this simultaneous behavior in huge flocks of birds and schools of fish. And it's really difficult to explain how these distant biological entities can respond simultaneously by just postulating an electromagnetic transmission. This has been a hot topic in years past in ethologists who study animal behavior. And I'm not saying that it's resolved, but I think there's room to consider putting a one-mind phenomena on the table.
So people attempt to explain it through known science. You're saying that you don't think it's completely explained by known science.
Well, to the extent that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, so I was just going to ask, is one mind science?
Well, it certainly competes with similar science in other areas. For example, this idea of non-local mind is not a phenomenon that's limited to people who have these distant simultaneous experiences. Non-locality is a concept which arose in physics, fundamental particle physics. And people have heard of things like Bell's theorem, which shows that two electrons are in contact, and then you separate them, even theoretically, to the ends of the universe, and you change one, the other changes instantly and to the same degree. Now, nobody knows how that works. So it is true that we don't know how these non-local consciousness mediated experiences work in humans, but I have to say we shouldn't be too hard on human experiments, because the physicists who represent the most accurate science that has ever been invented by people, they are also at a loss to explain how non-local events occur in particle physics. So if it's unknown how this happens among physicists, I think it's okay for us to sort of give ourselves permission to say, wait a minute, we don't understand how this works, but maybe we will in the future.
And what is your theory about it? Is your theory that ultimately there will be a scientific explanation for this and we just don't know it yet, or that this is beyond science, this is spirituality?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I think that we're at school in our ability to understand how space and time operate. And I think that there are mysteries about how spatial separation can actually be understood. I think it's safe to say now that we're deceived by spatial separation. Things can be united even though they're at a distance. This is the heart of the message of non-locality in physics. So whether or not we will come to a rational, logical explanation, I don't know. Maybe we're going to have to change what the meaning of logic actually is. But it's certainly wonderful to be alive and contemplating these things now. And I'm not at all disheartened by what we'll understand in the future. I think our imperative now is to go with the evidence, not to discard evidence because it doesn't fit with our theories, but to actually honor the evidence and try to reason how these things could be true.
How about premonitions? What would be the explanation for those? Because I know you believe in those pretty strongly, right?
Yeah, people can understand what's going to happen in the future. They can have premonitions about what's happening at a distance.
But a lot of times they're wrong.
Yes, that's right. There's a huge error rate in premonitions. Premonitions comes from the word pre and monere, which means a forewarning, which suggests that a lot of these things happen before horrible things happen to us. We see bad stuff coming, and you invoke the evolutionary advantage of this sort of thing. And I think you can understand premonitions in the same sense. I think there's a huge evolutionary advantage to people who could see disasters, the lion in the bush, that sort of thing that may do you in. It would be evolutionarily helpful to know about an impending danger before it happened. So I think there's a good case to be made that premonitions fit an evolutionary model.
But as far as scientific explanations for it, nothing yet, huh?
Non-local mind.
Non-local mind.
Yeah. Mind that is not confined to specific points in space, and certainly in the case of premonitions, not confined to specific points in time either. So mind can be non-local in one of two ways. It can be non-local in space or time, or both. I think that's the model that we're headed toward. I don't see any way around it.
And in your view, as we've said, the mind survives the death of the body.
Yeah, I think that's the ultimate payoff here. I think that that's a lesson which fits a spiritual connotation, but also it's borne out in stories that people with non-local experiences in the near-death area and children who remember past lives and so on. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that immortality comes out of the idea of non-local mind. I think it fits with it.
And what do you say about the existence of God? God.
Well, I think my way of my favorite terminology has to do with a universal mind, universal wisdom, cosmic consciousness, something of that sort. I grew up, like a lot of people in the United States, with the idea of a bearded character in a long flowing robe. That just doesn't work for me anymore. But I think there is a great universal wisdom that we may not be able to comprehend that is at the foot of all this stuff, including the cosmos and the universe at large. I don't think it's an accident.
So there's a creator.
Yeah, I think there was probably a beginning, and I think that fits with the concept of a creator.
But what that creator is up to now, no idea, huh?
Yeah, I think the universe is benevolent. I think that's what the creator is up to. I think we have a sense of this in people who experience near-death phenomena, most of them return and say that that was the most transformative, joyful experience that they have not only had in their life, but that they could conceive. So I don't brush these off as fantasies or hallucinations at all. I think they're probably a valid insight to the way the universe works.
So what changes would you like to see when it comes to science, as far as teaching, med schools, for instance, et cetera?
Yeah, I would like to see this body of evidence that you and I have been talking about here put on the menu, the curriculum, and our medical schools and our colleges and universities. Most kids go through college and university and even medical school and come out with a very materialistic view of how things work. They are often taught that if you go beyond materialism, you're just on thin ice. I would like to see this kind of information, these kinds of experiments that you and I have been talking about, made part of the menu. So I would just say what we need to do is just to do good science. I don't think we need to get involved in religion or spirituality at the university and college level, but I just think that it would be sufficient now to put this sort of information in the curriculum and just see where it goes. We're making progress in medical schools. Back in 1993, when I got involved in this business, there were only 3 of the nation's 120 medical schools that had any coursework looking at the sort of stuff we've been talking about. Now, the vast majority of medical schools in the United States look at the connections between religious and spiritual practice and the health outcomes. That is a huge advance. I think this will continue because there's an increasing recognition that people who follow some sort of spiritual path, which usually involves this one mind idea that we've been talking about, they live longer and they have a lower incidence of all the major diseases you want to look at, including heart disease and cancer. So there's a real practical payoff, a benefit health-wise for addressing these sorts of ideas. So I would just say do good science, go where the evidence leads us. I'd be happy if we just did that.
What about phonies and charlatans out there? Do they concern you?
You bet. They're not.
How do we guard against that?
Well, I think the same approach, good science. I mean, if they have evidence that all of this stuff we've been talking about is phony, let's hear it. But I'm convinced of this. The skeptics and the phonies and the charlatans are not all on the side of spirituality. A lot of them masquerade as skeptical scientists. Actually, I have a terrible habit. I collect comments that I think are reprehensible from scientists. The one that is my all-time favorite is a scientist who was looking at this sort of information we've been talking about, and he said, "This is the sort of thing I wouldn't believe, even if it were true." Now, these comments are said, as a point of pride. I think they're an embarrassment to the true scientific tradition, which is prove it. Let's see the evidence. Open-mindedness. That's what I'm in favor of.
And more scientific studies. You embrace the idea of having scientific studies into this idea.
Totally. Absolutely.
And who's doing those right now? Where are the leaders doing? Are these happening at universities and med schools?
Well, the first step has been to honor the evidence that's been adduced so far. And as I mentioned, the majority of medical schools now are doing that. The connections between spiritual and religious practice and health now number in the thousands. These studies are being done everywhere. There are certain non-academic settings like the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which has been at the forefront of this for, almost 30 years. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory recently shut down after about 30 years of doing their stuff. And so you see these little bits and pieces in the culture that are tuning into this sort of thing, but we've still got a long way to go. particularly in medicine, I think you're seeing one of the most robust efforts of trying to come to grips with this stuff because of the health implications.
Well, in a country that certainly appears more divided than it's been in perhaps our lifetimes, I don't know if you agree with that. You look to be a touch older than me, but not much. The idea of one mind certainly seems to be a good thing for people to be embracing today, right?
Well, that's my opinion. I mean, that's actually my life work, trying to promote the idea from a scientific point of view. People want to join in from the spiritual side. I'm glad to have them, but I think the story will be told whether or not the experiments point in this direction or not.
But are we making progress, or are we regressing in heading toward one-mindedness in your view?
Well, it's sort of hard to tell. I asked this question of David Bohm once, one of the world's great physicists, while he was still alive. I asked him, Professor Bohm, do you think we're going to make it? At that time, I was concerned about the environmental degradation and where we were headed. And he sort of furrowed his brow and thought. And finally, he said, Larry, we'll make it barely. I think that pretty much represents my attitude. I do not think that time is on our side. I think there are pockets of awareness about the nature of consciousness that exist on the earth that sort of dwarf where we stand in the United States currently. I hope that changes, and I'm confident that it will. But I think it will be a close run thing. And I think...
is there any culture out there in the world that you feel is closest to this?
This may sound contradictory, but I think that there are pockets in the United States that are closer to this awareness than anywhere else in the world. And this is one reason that I'm confident to do my work in America. Now, our hope is that this spreads and will catch on in the academic community at large. But I don't think that there's any place in the world that can compete with the research evidence that comes out of certain elements in this culture. And that's why I'm proud to call myself an American.
And where is the pocket? Is it in Santa Fe?
Well, this is
where you are?
Santa Fe is an interesting place. Let me just leave it like that. There are places that Bill Bingston's work, which is as an independent, has been replicated at academic centers around the country. ION's Institute of Noetic Sciences is certainly on the map. There are many other areas in medicine that are affiliated with medical schools that are carrying this work forward. So actually, there are too many to name, but they're out there doing good work, often silently and under the radar. But that's not to say that they're not for nothing. They really are, I think, making a tremendous contribution about where we will eventually wind up.
I was expecting you to say something like the Buddhist communities are more advanced in this type of thinking. I mean, is there a community in that regard that you feel embraces this more than others?
Well, the Dalai Lama has been famous for advocating an experimental approach to spirituality. He was asked once if we got to the point where the experiments bumped up against Buddhism, which way would he go? And he said, well, Buddhism usually have ways of going with the experimental flow. So Buddhism, I think, is on board, although not by way of doing experiments themselves. It's more of a backseat approval of the experimental approach.